Our speaker now is Tanya Luhrmann. She is the Howard and Jesse Watkins University Professor in the Anthropology Department at Stanford University. Her work focuses on the edge of experience, and she has done ethnographic field work with, and this is perhaps a partial list, homeless and psychotic women, people who hear voices, evangelical Christians who seek to hear God speak back, and Zoroastrians who set out to create a more mystical faith, and with people who practice magic. Okay, so that's the edge of experience. Among her number of books are Persuasions of the Witch's Craft, Ritual Magic in Contemporary England, Of Two Minds, The Growing Disorder in American Psychiatry, and When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. Her new book, God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others, will be published later this year by Princeton University Press. Responding to Tanya this morning is Eve Danziger, Professor and Chair of the Department of Anthropology here at UVA. Her research on long-term field work has been into the language and culture of the Mopan, Mayan people of East Central America, to investigate the role of language in the construction of indigenous knowledge. She's particularly interested in how the categories of individual thought are shaped by those of socially shared but culturally particular convention and culture. All right, that's the sport superior. Or anyway, she's the author of Relatively Speaking, Language, Thought, and Kinship Among the Mopan Maya, and of numerous articles and book chapters. Okay, thank you. Tanya.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Well, let me try to make sure I'm timing myself. All right. So I'm going to begin with a question that's obsessing me these days, which is why some people and people in some social worlds experience spirit more vividly than others, even when some of those others really, really want to. So I think of myself as an anthropologist of invisible others, of the way that people interact with invisible others. As you've heard, I wrote my first book on people who call themselves magicians, who are trying to interact with Demeter and Caradun and Cernunnos. My second book was about Zoroastrians who are trying to reconnect with Ahura Mazda and make Ahura Mazda their god vivid to them. I read a book about evangelical Christians who sought to have a back and forth, intimate relationship with a God who would talk back. And more recently, I've been spending time in new charismatic churches in Chennai, in South India, and in Accra, in Ghana. And I have had a misspent life. I've gotten initiated into a Santeria cult. I've spent time in a Black Catholic church. I've hung out in a Baal Tshuva shul. I was in a California cult for a while. I hang out with people now who try to create invisible friends who will talk back to them. And these are the folks we're putting into the scanner. And anyway, the point I want to make, or the point I want to start with, is the observation that some people just don't have cool experiences, and others have them pretty often. And these experiences are pretty important. They're at the heart of most religions. And the experiences I'll kind of hone into are voices, the experience of hearing somebody speak whom nobody else can see. These experiences matter. They're evidence of spirit. You know that spirit is there because, God spoke to Moses. That's how Moses knew he was there. Krishna spoke to Arjuna. Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. Jesus spoke to his disciples. When spirits speak, it's their speaking that gives you a kind of empirical evidence that those spirits are real. Voices have mattered in history. Christianity would have been different if Augustine hadn't heard a voice. So Augustine, torn against himself, trying to convert, is told, meets a friend, has a conversation, is so upset that he runs out of his house and throws himself at the foot of a fig tree, and he hears a voice. And that voice tells him to take the scripture and read, and that voice changes Christianity. eve of the Montgomery bus boycotts, 1956. Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of trying to wonder about what he should do. He's gotten death threats to his family. He doesn't know whether he should proceed. He sits at his kitchen table, he prays, and Jesus says to him, "I will be with you." And he goes forward. Voices matter to ordinary people. So the next person is somebody that I met, evangelical Christian. She graduated from the University of Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz. Best job she could get was the morning shift at 7-Eleven. She was not very impressed with this. And she said to me, one morning this woman came in and she looked like she'd been up all night. She looked like it had been rough. She threw her stuff on the counter, 2 6-packs of Miller Lite, some cat food, and a food product of some sort, donuts, I think. And she looked at me and she said, "Hey, can you get me a carton of cigarettes?" And I'm thinking, excellent. This is what I want to be doing with my life. So I turned around, I rolled my eyes, and I started thinking my judgmental thoughts. In that moment, I literally heard the voice of God say to me, "Do not judge this woman. I have created her in my image and I love her." And poor woman, I almost fell over. I'm trying to give her change and I'm like, whoa, the voice of God spoke to me. I have been changed ever since. So these events, they're not uncommon, but they don't happen to everyone. Why? Part of the answer, the piece I'll talk about this morning, is that I think it has something to do with the way that humans think about thought, and that these are culturally distributed. I'm going to begin with what Gregory Bateson called an ecology of mind, a way of thinking about thoughts in the context of other thoughts, in the context of our relationship with the world. I'll begin with William James and his observation that the universal conscious fact is not that feelings and thoughts exist, but that I think and I feel. There's a feeling of mindness that has something to do with the way that we experience our thought. And you could say that the human condition looks something like this, that what it is to be conscious, what it is to be aware, is to have a sense of an insideness, for want of a better term, a mindness, a thoughtness, and a kind of out there-ness of which we are aware. That there's some crude sense. That's kind of the story of consciousness. But you can imagine that experience quite differently. So you could imagine the modern condition as the insideness separated from the outsideness by a bounded wall. That's the way Charles Taylor imagines it invites us to imagine the modern condition, that there's this, that because of the emergence of this notion of the brain, and because of the changes that have happened in the 20th century, we have a sense that our mind is an epiphenomenon. It's really important. It's who we are. It's our identity. We need to say what we think because that's who we are. Our thoughts are us. But they don't do anything. It's hard for us to explain where they come from. They don't act in the world. They motivate humans. The humans act in the world. The thoughts are I think of this as the citadel theory of mind, that the mind is really important, but it's up on a hill, away from the city. It's not doing anything, just kind of keeping guard over stuff. You could imagine the mind very differently. So Taylor talks about this as porosity briefly. You could imagine that that thoughts have a kind of power of their own, that they go through the mesh that separates the mind from the world, and they do stuff. They act as if they're in accord. They have supernatural power. So I want to suggest that at the heart of all of these activities is some notion of thoughts having agentic authority, their own power. So central idea in witchcraft is that anger and envy, depending on your social world, they kind of act on the world. They go and affect somebody else's body. And the pursuit is the idea that there's an intention. I make the talisman, the magician. I make it. And the making gives it power. That intention somehow sits inside like a tool and it does something in the world. Twin connections. We know that people, there's something kind of special circumstances, special kinds of thoughts, but somehow twins separated by thousands of miles, they know what's happening with the other twin, if it's an important thought, if it needs to be known. And I'll call this porosity, the idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in unordinary ways. I want to suggest that porosity intuitions are easily available, but they're socially elaborated and compelling for different reasons. So I want to suggest that most of us have porosity intuitions. We mostly think that wishing, because of our model of mind, our 20th century secular model of mind, we mostly think that wishing doesn't affect the world. But I can tell you, and election eve 2016, it seemed to me that a lot of people around me were behaving as if wishing hard would affect the world directly. We mostly think that we generate our own thoughts, but many of us have had the intuition that the anger came to me. I don't know, it just came to me. Or the poem, it arrived in my mind. That's inspiration. We mostly think that our minds are private, other people don't have access. If you believe in a God, you probably think that that God has a privileged access. Or if you know that somebody's psychic, you think that they have a privileged access. We have very complicated ideas, even in our secular society, about whether mind is or is not part of the body. When somebody dies, we think they're dead. But if you've got a shred of religiosity, you probably have a thought that something of the person might survive, or at least you hope that they might survive, or you think that they might survive. Any thought of a ghost is a reference to the idea that there's something about minds getting free of bodies. So there are different social conditions that different social settings provide the conditions in which versions of these ideas will flourish. So one of the things that anthropologists have taught us, for example, is that ideas about witchcraft, they flourish in agrarian societies. We don't find them in hunter-gatherer societies. There's something about the social conditions that means that some of these intuitions get elaborated, made into special forms. Often they come with rules. They happen to special people. You need special tools. You need special training. But there are different social conditions under which porosity ideas will kind of emerge. I want to suggest that because porosity intuitions are about the relationship of awareness and world, they might affect the interpretation of ambiguous events. So now I want to tell you about the Mind and Spirit Project. This is a project that I've been running for the last 3 years. And it's a team of people. We use anthropologists that are competent in the local language. We've worked in China, Ghana, Thailand, the United States, and Vanuatu. And we had this kind of amazing team of senior anthropologists, psychologists, an historian of religion, a philosopher of mind. This is who we are one sunny afternoon. And that's the postdoctoral field workers down the side, and our data czar, and our project manager, and the team. So to compare, you put something in the box. We spent a lot of time worrying about how we were going to compare across social groups. Comparison is relatively uncommon in anthropology, but it's fun. It teaches you stuff with all its limitations. So what we did, we spent a lot of time together trying to think about what we wanted to compare, how we were going to think about the nature of mind, how we were going to capture mind and study it, and how we were going to ask questions about spirit. And we continued these conversations even as the field workers were off in the field doing field work. So this is the American crew. That's me and our Josh Brahinsky, who did the U.S. work, and Nikki Rossender. And there's Felicity Aulino at 6 a.m. in Thailand, and John Doolan at midnight in Ghana. We're trying to have these conversations over Skype every week, so we were spread about the world. And this is who we are. There was me, there's Kara, who's the sort of the data czar. The field workers that were out in their settings, they had a team of people who were collecting data and putting data on pieces of paper and scanning the data and sending it in. And then Nikki and her team on the ground was kind of organizing the paper and putting it into Excel files. And we have 38,000 pages of transcript data. We were trying to read the data and code the data and have people reread the data and recode the data. So let me tell you quickly what we did. So the question was, is the way that you think about your mind, does it affect the way that you experience spirit? So we did a bunch of different methods. We did intense ethnographic interviews with faithful people, and in there was a core group in every country of the same, more or less the same kinds of charismatic Christians. We did short face-to-face interviews with members of the general population, different group, and another core group of charismatic Christians. We did pen and paper surveys with college students, because college students do pen and paper surveys all the time called exams, so they're used to this stuff. So we did pen and paper surveys, totally new groups of people. And then we thought we saw something really important to us. And so we went back to a new set of college students and did and asked our questions again, just to see whether we would get the same results. And so we asked a bunch of questions. We asked questions in many different ways. We asked questions about how people thought about mental causation. Can thought of its own accord act in the world? So we asked people about, if Mary and Martha, and Mary's really angry at Martha, and let's say Martha falls ill. Could that be because of Mary's anger? How would that work? What do you think about that? We asked about mental vulnerability. Could somebody put a thought in somebody else's mind? We asked about mental sharing. Should you share your anger with other people? Is that polite? Impolite? We asked about make-believe, the imagination. And we asked a bunch of questions about spirit. We asked, and these were long, some of these were long, complex interviews, some of them were sheets of paper. We asked how people heard from the biggest God in the area. How did God communicate? How did you know that God was there? And then we asked about a series of core experiences. Voices, ever hear God's voice? Has God ever spoken to you in a way you can hear with your ears? We would probe in the rich interviews. We would probe. Did you turn your head to see who was speaking? Did it feel like it was with your ears? Was it outside? We asked about visions. We asked about senses of presence. We asked about sleep paralysis and out-of-body experiences. So the first bunch of the work was field work, and this is what field work looks like. I was actually there that evening, where this was a woman being initiated into a spirit possession practice in Ghana, where she will talk to the gods. And one of the things we saw from the field work is that people have very different models of mind. They think about the nature of mind quite differently. And just to give you a taste of what we saw, so in Ghana, we saw that people did a kind of bundling of the inside and the outside, which is not to say, and people, our Ghanaians are perfectly aware of being an inner awareness and an outer world. But one of the things you see in this interview is that our subject, our participant, is kind of going back and forth between whether she heard it with her ears or the voice. So the question is God's voice. First she says, I hear it in my mind. But she said something different a little earlier. So the interviewer comes back, did you hear it with your ears? She says, no, I hear it with my mind. But she said something different before. So he says, did you hear it with your ears or with your ears or not with your ears? I hear it with my ears. Now the interviewer says, did you turn your head to see who's speaking? You don't really do that if you've had a thought in your mind. So it's sort of, and it seemed like this kind of interview came up again and again and again, where people just weren't so interested in the boundary between the mind and the world. In China, we had a sort of different story. In China, and particularly in urban China, people were really interested in the way that the mind made them trip over God, that they were worried that because of their mind, they weren't hearing God directly. They didn't worry that way in rural China. In Thailand, Felicity spoke about a kaleidoscopic mind. She thought people spoke as if what happened in the mind was somehow intricately interacting with what happened in the world, as if the conditions of karma, the karmic moral conditions of the person, were shaping what the person actually experienced. And she found that the more, as she talked to people about whether they experienced things and other people experienced things, they kept saying, it depends. It depends upon their karma. In Vanuatu, Rachel Smith found that people were really worried about vulnerable minds. They were really worried that somebody else might put something in their mind and make them fall in love with somebody or change their, deplete their will so they wouldn't be able to work as they once had worked. They thought that the mind was weak. And in the US, they really talked about that wall, even though they'd never read Charles Taylor, as far as I could tell. They really spoke. We would ask them about somebody else's angry feelings and whether those angry feelings could affect the body directly. And they almost all said, oh no, we don't think like that. And then it was as if they thought, oh, I'm an evangelical Christian. I ought to believe that this is possible. I ought to believe in demonic possession. And so maybe I do. And they would go back and forth and back and forth. And they talked about the need for God to break the wall so that they could experience God directly. And there are actually books called Breaking In about this. Another thing that we did was we gave people the absorption scale. So this is a scale I've worked with for a while now. And this is, I think this picks up an attitude towards the mind. It's a more psychological measure, or that's the people who made it think of it as a psychological measure. There are statements like, I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. I can change noise into music by the way that I listen to it. There's something about taking a stance towards your inner world and being caught up in your imagination in a way that gives you delight. In my work, folks like her are highly absorbed, and people who are more likely to look like that are more likely to say yes or true to more of those absorption questions. So we found something kind of cool in this work. We found, to use this admittedly reductive language, but kind of interesting, we found that 2 factors predict voices, visions, and presence. I'm sure there are more. I'm just very excited to have found at least 2. And they are porosity and absorption. So going back to those intimate fieldwork interviews, we did 60 to 80 rich ethnographic interviews with people of faith. And again, there was a subset of charismatic Christians. Porosity and absorption predict their voices and visions, even among the charismatic Christians, even with people with the shared theology. We did 150 standardized face-to-face interviews with folks in the local DMV, and some of them were charismatic Christians. Voice and porosity and absorption predict voices, visions, presence, even within those charismatic Christians. We did short face-to-face interviews, so that's what that looks like. We did these 100 standardized, specific pen and paper surveys, asking questions a little differently because we borrowed some surveys that other people had worked with, and so they had a little bit more. So that's one way of doing this kind of work. That's what this looks like. And when we asked with this kind of method, that questions that asked about porosity, questions that asked about absorption, predicted spiritual experience. We thought that was pretty cool, so we did a new confirmatory survey. So we put all of our different measures that we'd used in these very different methods into the same survey packet, handed them to a group of undergraduates, 100 in each country, and in fact, the results held. So I'm going to put up a confusing slide. I'm not expecting you to read this properly, but this is sort of our summary slide. You could describe what we did as doing 4 studies. And in study 1, we looked at porosity and we looked at absorption. And along the bottom, that horizontal axis is the way that we counted up the number of yeses our subjects gave. And up the side are the 24 spiritual event questions we asked. Each dot is a person. Each color is a country. And the thing to pay attention to is there's the kind of the slope of the line is going up. I should say I've learned how to do a point-and-click statistics. These slides were made by Kara Weissman. And what's striking is that there's something that feels like we're capturing something important. It feels as if it's real. And we've asked in many different it turns out this is not due to some people in the group just wanting to say yes to a bunch of stuff all the time. That's something we explored. What I want to suggest is that this suggests that folks who are committed to or who think about their minds more as if their mind is separated from the world by a wall, as if their mind is epiphenomenal, they have a brain, their thoughts are really important, but they don't do stuff in the world. They seem to report fewer of these spiritual experiences. How might you make sense of that? Well, I think that these cool, weird experiences have a kind of in-between quality. You hear God speak, but you know that nobody else has heard it. You have a sense that it wasn't in your mind, but maybe it wasn't fully in the world. You feel the presence, but you look and it's gone. There's this kind of sort of oddness of these experiences. And so this is my best attempt to make sense of how these experiences, I'll call the cool, weird experiences, the voices and the visions, come to pass, that maybe there's an ultimate source. And then very, very quickly they interpret that. Some people call this reality monitoring, that there's some kind of micro-moment judgment of the event, and that judgment changes the event that people experience and report. I'm going to give you a simple-minded illustration of what I think I hear people talking about, and I'm going to do this just because it's fun. So this is my simple-minded interpretation. I'm going to give you a sentence that many people will experience as being the sound of birds. But if I tell you that's really the first line of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, you'll probably hear it. Sorry. Okay, so now let me take just about 10 minutes to talk to you about the other side of this story, which is psychosis. And I should say that one of my deep interests in all of this is thinking about the similarities and differences between voice hearing among folks who are religious and without a need for care, and voice hearing among people who are psychotic. So I spent many, many hours on the street with homeless psychotic women, and I have spent time also in Chennai and in Accra, also with folks who need hospital care, are the same kinds of persons. And I wanted to talk briefly about this project that I've done, and that was the first publication. And we've done it again with up to 60 people. But in this work, I looked at 20 people, I and my colleagues, and we tried to do this in a way that meant that we minimized the limitations of my being a white-skinned American. I and my colleagues talked to 20 people in hospital settings in San Mateo, California, Accra, Ghana, and Chennai, South India. And we asked them about their experiences. So all these folks are in the hospital. They're all hearing voices. We asked them a bunch of questions about their experience, including, do you ever have positive experiences? Do you like your voice? Do you know who your voice is? Have you met in the flesh the person whose voice you hear? And some other things. And so here is the charming caricature. Americans hear horrible voices telling them that they're worthless and should die. Africans hear an audible God who tells them to ignore their evil voices. And South Asians hear annoying relatives who tell them to get dressed and to clean up. And there's, this is a caricature. These voices are more alike than different. But let me quickly run through what I thought I heard. Americans hated their voices. Every single American said, hearing voices means you're crazy. They were assaulted by their voices. They didn't know who was speaking when their voices spoke. The violence in the voices was striking. Really quite striking. And again, we've now done this with 60 people in each country. Torturing people. The voices say, take their eye out with a fork, cut somebody's head, drink their blood, really nasty stuff. In the first sample, not one American said that a dominant voice was a positive voice. Chennai, over half the sample heard their kin, so they knew who was talking. In Chennai, when the voice was mean, it was often sexually shaming. Somebody would get onto a bus, and the voice, in their experience, would announce to the bus that everybody knows that you masturbate. Sort of embarrassed, from the person's experience, embarrass them in front of the busload of people. In Accra, half the sample said that their voice was God, and that God had helped them in their time of trouble. If God hadn't been with them when they were struggling with their schizophrenia, it would have been much, much worse. And both in Ghana and in Chennai, the voices were more like people. People would say things like, they keep me company, even sometimes when they didn't like the voice. They would say, the voice keeps them company. They talk about the voices having conversations, and again, they often know the person from whom they're hearing. So this is my inference, that there's something striking about the American, and I'm inferring here that the Americans are using this more Charles Taylor model of mind, that there's something about the modern condition in which people imagine, for the Americans, more than these other worlds, the mind is imagined as separated from the world by a wall, and that when the wall begins to crack, it is terrifying. So the striking thing about talking to folks with psychosis was that when people hear voices in this setting, it's like their entire self is at risk. It's just feels like the citadel. The foundations of the citadel are going, and who you are, you're a broken brain, and it's awful. And I don't want to be romantic, but the voices are a little less costly in other parts of the world. So I think there really is a story to tell about different ways of imagining the mind and about different social consequences to the way that you imagine the mind. And I think that there are some costly consequences to this kind of enlightenment model of the mind, or more modern biomedical model of the mind, which kind of makes the mind both centrally important and also epiphenomenal. So thank you.
Okay. Let's move this aside a little bit. We'll leave this up. Thank you, Tanya, and thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed the paper and the talk, and very much in sympathy with the high-level conclusion that the way you categorize or compartmentalize things can affect the way you experience them, and the way you categorize and compartmentalize can be a function of cultural learning. And I had prepared a little demonstration, but Tanya perhaps took care of that with the birds. But let's go with the linguistic demonstration. Apologies to those who heard this. This is classic in Linguistic Anthropology 101. But if we think about the two words, English words pill and spill, we notice that the letter P appears in both the words. Would you think that the letter P represents the same sound? Those who haven't tried this exercise, who are English speakers, especially native English speakers, will normally say, yeah, that letter P represents the same sound. Now we can all try it. Hold the back of your hand against your mouth and say the word pill Now say the word spill. So what you're expected to experience in the word pill is a little puff of air as it hits your hand. Feel free to try this again. Pill, pill. And when you say spill, there's no puff of air coming at that P, right? Pill, spill. And the reality is that those are two different sounds that are experienced in a sensory way as the same sound as a result of the linguistic practice of speaking English. And we know it's as a result of speaking English because if you speak Hindi, then not only do they sound different to you in a sensory way, but they're also used to create differences among words with different meanings. So pill with the puff of air and pull without the puff of air mean two different things, and it's as a result of that, the categorization, that you hear them differently. So we have enormously robust evidence that this is a real phenomenon. So the sort of preliminary question of whether cultural learning can affect sensory perception is already answered. The answer is yes. So, so what Tanya is talking about is some version of categorical perception that gets into a more conceptual realm and then the sort of meta-conceptual. In other words, what if it wasn't just my using those sounds to make meaning differences, but something about the way I thought about sounds that made the difference, thought about hearing sounds makes a difference to how I hear sounds and so on. So there's that, actually harks back a little bit to the question of art and reflection and being inside a frame that heightens consciousness of what's inside the frame. But there are some issues that I want to raise about the particulars of this paper and how, to get Tanya maybe to say a little more or think a bit more with us about how we might do it differently. It's quite, it's clear that the big picture or the sort of big type of questions, well, in the written version, there was a distinction made between a certain kind of belief that thoughts can get into your head from outside and the belief that thoughts can go out from into to out, and that's the sort of witchcraft phenomenon. It's not necessarily clear that those need to be dealt with the same way in a cultural framing, right? So that hearing voices and believing in witchcraft could be two completely different things. It'd be nice to know. The focus in the paper is very much on the thoughts coming in, the question of, at least in what's presented explicitly, the question of if you hear voices, do they seem real? Are they coming from somewhere? Do you hear them with your ears? Do you turn your head to see where in the outside are they coming from? So the link to the question of witchcraft and the outgoing thoughts is left a little bit hanging and might need a little more buttressing, or at least be presented as, let's ask this question next. Is there a direct correspondence between what you called vulnerability and what you called potency in the written version? Like, can we just go from one to the other? The metaphor of the wall suggests that you can. The wall is porous. You could go in, you could go out, but perhaps it doesn't work quite like that.
I think that voices is the phenomenon.
Okay, so let me get to that, because the next issue is, so let's stick with we hear voices, voices can come in from outside. There is a little bit of slippage between thoughts and voices in the way that this is discussed, so that on the one hand, if you think that thoughts can come in, then you might be thinking voices can come in. Maybe thoughts and voices are the same thing. And, maybe they are. Actually, I might be willing to go there. But we might have to defend that position. And we might have to say, are there thoughts that are not voices? I might, as a linguistic anthropologist, be prepared to argue that there are no thoughts that are not voices, but I've learned that is not usually a popular position. People usually want to argue with me about that. So that issue of thoughts and voices, but if voices are what's really of concern, and certainly the phenomenon of hearing voices, if what we're really talking about is voices, then we're talking again about almost the voices that come in, and the question of hearing other people's voices inside your head has a tradition of discussion, again, in the realm of quotation and what's sometimes called intertextuality. I'm thinking about Bakhtin, Voloshinov, and Vygotsky, the idea that these would be the voices of social others, that it's routine for people to internalize the voices of others. And again, in fact, most of what we as adults come to think of as our own voice is something that we have pulled together as a sort of composite, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not, from all these voices of others that we hear in our heads. And we go to the question of how many times have you sort of heard your own mother's voice in your head? Now you don't turn around to, well, maybe you do, but there's that interesting issue. But hearing other people's voices in your head is something that has a certain kind of theory behind it, and indeed the pulling together of other people's voices to make the self is something that we're familiar with. And it's particularly interesting, to think about, as you do in the psychosis part, well, whose voices get heard, and the cross-cultural differences, the sort of very compelling speculation about the very individualist psychic model that Americans might be assumed to hold, and then the sort of terror at having that model breached without, where, again, from a sort of social scientist point of view, we know that individualism is breached all the time by social others. But the model says this shouldn't be breached. So we're down to, the question of, does it feel like it's coming from outside or doesn't it? The idea of it being a voice, has this other kind of pedigree. But let's say that the final question that I have, or set of questions, have to do with meta-language. So it's a comparative project, of course, and so we want to know, you've put the questions very, very clearly, does the way that you think about mind affect the way that you experience spirit? And, I actually have a little riff on the word thought, which does the usual thing. So in Mopon, there wouldn't be a single translation. You have one kind of thinking that is sort of brooding and worrying and turning it over in your mind, and it's relatively negative. Not really a very healthy thing to do. And you have another kind of thinking, which, and two different words, which is a momentary bringing to awareness. Oh, I thought of you yesterday, right? So you have already possibly the idea that thought is not a universal or not a category that we can sensibly bring. But I'm very worried about mind and spirit, because they appear in the sort of hypothesis. Does the way you think about mind affect the way you experience spirit? So we really would like them to be, on the one hand, clearly articulated, and then on the other hand, separate. If we're going to put the question like that, and I might propose that maybe we don't have to put it that, we don't have to have this kind of dependent, independent variable framing, but that's what you're giving us. So the difference between mind and spirit has to be very clear in order to be able to ask that kind of question. And so what I want to ask you, I suppose, is how would you characterize the difference? And then in particular, to pull apart for me what I did experience as a bit of a confusion, which is that this question of whether you hear the voice with your ears or not, and how you hear the voice, is presented as evidence on both sides. So on the one hand, if you hear it from the outside, you have a less porous model of the mind. So the question, do you hear the voices coming in? So I may have been misunderstanding, so you can come and explain. But I felt that I was reading and hearing these questions about how external are the voices, as if that was giving evidence about how porous is your mind-world boundary, in other words, a question about mind. And then on the other hand, evidence about your spiritual experience. So that was giving me the feeling of something that wasn't quite holding together the way it should. So if there's an issue of just clarifying there, then I'd like to hear about it. I'll leave it there because I just really want to hear more, and I want to hear what other people have to say. Thank you, Tanya.